She wore her hair around her neck at the foot of the bed where the lower things crept. Neath the sea of white roses.
Welcome to God is Open. I am your host, Christopher Fisher. Today on God is Open, we're going to be talking about God's self-deprecation, God's humiliation, God's public shame and humiliation to the people. And this is pretty evident throughout the Bible. The Bible often couches this in terms of marriage. There's analogies to marriage. There's marriage metaphors in which God is the husband, Israel, Judah, believers, those are the wives, and the wife will often engage with sexual relations with other men. Play the harlot, play the whore, play the prostitute, not even get money in some passages, which makes it extra vile. You're just doing this for free, makes it extra vile. And who is the recipient of all this humiliation? It's God. God's building these analogies that are shameful to him. Because what is shameful? If you're in a marriage and your wife is having sexual relations with a man who's not you, she's giving her heart, her soul, her body to other men. And guess what? Sometimes, like in Hosea, you're raising other men's children. There's children of whoredom, not your own. The dad is still alive, and you're raising another man's kid. So this is public shame, public humiliation. And even back in this ancient culture, it's a shameful thing to do to have your wife sleeping around. This was a capital crime back then. This is not to happen. But men who endured this, men who put up with this, men who took their wife back after these instances, these people were very low socially. This is humiliation. God is casting himself as these people. In these parables, within the Bible, throughout the Bible, it's a continuing biblical motif in various passages, God's public humiliation, where he receives back to himself a cheating wife of whoredom. So I've been going over Hosea with my children. We've been going verse by verse, chapter by chapter. And Hosea is one of the most painfully obvious references to this type of behavior, this public humiliation of God, that God admits to, describes, and ascribes to himself. And this is a shocking thing to Christians, because Christians don't like to think of God as having this humiliation. God can't be humiliated because, greatest being theology, God's the greatest being conceivable. And so in no way can he bear shame. In no way can he be degraded. But what's happening here is God is involved with self-deprecation. God is demeaning himself. God is acting because of his passions, because of his love. He's going against his better judgment often in these cases and returning to a cheating wife and admitting as much, going against rules that he himself has imposed for marriage. Hosea, of course, is one of the most shameful examples in which God then takes a prophet to publicly illustrate what's going on between him and Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, as opposed to Judah, and has Hosea marry a prostitute to illustrate the current situation. Not a good time to be a prophet of God. So I made this meme and I put it on Twitter. Hosea, go become a cuck to show Israel how they are cucking me. And then it's one of those, what do we want to call it? The guy with the sunken eyes and all blacked out, kind of like the sadness, the depressed, you're in a bad position. And Hosea just goes along with it, with the statement, yes, God. And of course, people are going to take issue with this. There's a guy on Twitter who first tries to fault me for making images of God, and then I talk about it and say, well, that's probably more about idols rather than a depiction of this nature. And then he instantly pivots, because his problem was never with me. It was never with actually me making a picture of God. His problem was with who I represent. His problem was in-group, out-group relations, so he pivots to a different thing and starts criticizing my use of the term cuck in relation to God. That's a demeaning term. It's being applied to God. But this is my exact point. This term is God's own terminology, his own conceptions that he's placing on himself. Yeah, think about that. Think about the disconnect modern Christians have with actual biblical witness. Their conception of God doesn't allow for God having these self-deprecating remarks, so they are going to go out and attack me for using the same imagery that Hosea uses. It's okay for Hosea to do it because that's Hosea, that's in the Bible. Ignore all that. If I just put that in modern terms, now I am some sort of bad guy because I'm assigning a deprecating label to God. But again, that's my point. God endorses these labels for himself. God is illustrating this in Hosea. This is the entire point of Hosea and elsewhere in the Bible, that God engages in these humiliation rituals. God is degrading himself. Now, this might not fit perfect being theology, where God has to get the maximum amount of glory, and public humiliation is not part of that equation. But that's not the God of the Bible. The God within the Bible does go through humiliation rituals. Turning to Hosea 1:2, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom." Whose kids are these? They're not his kids. These children that he's going to be raising are genetically not related to him. He's going to be raising some other man's child. Some other man who used his wife for a sexual purpose and abandoned her. And he has to not only still be married to that woman, but also raise that other man's child. This is humiliating. This is cuckold behavior. God says, "For the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. The Lord said, "Call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I'll punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I'll put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel." Israel, of course, is the northern kingdom. Within Hosea, Judah, the southern kingdom, is considered full of integrity, still worshipers of God. They have not yet rebelled to the same extent as the northern kingdom, but they later will. Hosea is not written with this in mind. Hosea is written as if Judah is going to remain faithful, but Judah does not. And elsewhere we see in the Bible where God laments, he says, "Hey, I thought you would understand, Judah. I thought you would see what I did to Israel and that you would reform your behavior, but you did not." God's failed expectations for Judah results in more of this imagery in which God is portraying himself as a spurned husband, a humiliated husband, a husband that's in one of these circumstances for public ridicule. And then, on top of all of that, within Hosea, within other texts, he still wants Israel back. He still wants Judah back, making him in violation of not only law, a marriage law from Deuteronomy, but also a public mockery. She conceived again and bore a daughter, and the Lord said to him, "Call her name No Mercy, for I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all." And then, guess what? She has another child. And the Lord said, "Call his name Not My People, for you are not my people, and I am not your God." So all this imagery is all about violence. It's about divorce. It's about kicking Israel out, kicking them to the curb. There's very violent passages that follow. "Plead with your mother. Plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband." This is a divorce. "That she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked and make her as in the day she was born, and make her like the wilderness, and make her like a parched land, and kill her with thirst. Upon her children also I will have no mercy, because they are children of whoredom. For their mother has played the whore. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers, who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink." Skipping forward, "And I will lay waste her vines and her fig trees, of which she said, These are my wages, which my lovers have given me. I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall devour them. I will punish her for the feast days of the Baals, when she burned offerings to them and adorned herself with her ring and jewelry, and went after lovers and forgot me, declares the Lord." Very violent imagery. This is a jealous husband reacting to a wife who continually cheats with other men. His rage and jealousy builds. Why? Because she's violating the natural covenant, the natural order of a marriage, the natural role of a wife, and engaging in infidelity. A very shameful act. This should, if you're a man and you're not feeling this type of rage, if for even the thought of your wife having sex with other men, you're not in the biblical mindset. In the biblical mindset, this is shameful. This is a huge violation of morality. This is a death penalty offense within the Bible for wives to go out and have sex with other men. Death penalty for both the wife and the man that she is having relations with. This is not to be tolerated. God is not tolerating it here. But things turn. Things turn. People are let back in. The marriage is reconciled. Starting in Hosea 2:14, we see this reversal of fortune. Therefore, behold, I will lure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. And I will go give her the vineyards and make a valley of hope. Skipping forward, and in that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they shall be remembered by name no more. I will make for them a covenant on that day with the beasts of the fields, the birds of the heaven. I will abolish the bow and sword. Skipping forward, I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. This is a remarriage. After this horrific instance of infidelity on multiple occasions with multiple men in multiple scenarios, this trend that's been going on for a while, this public humiliation of God, in probably some of the harshest terms, there is a reconciliation. But what we might not understand on first reading this is also, again, another public humiliation. Let's turn to Walter Brueggemann's Theology of the Old Testament. In our third text, Deuteronomy 24:1-4, Moses enunciates a case law that is taken in the book of Deuteronomy to be a command of Yahweh. It concerns the rigorous requirements of marriage and the violation and termination thereof. When a marriage is terminated and the rejected wife is remarried, she cannot return to her first husband, even if they both wish it, because she is defiled. A return to the first husband would defile the land and would make an abomination to Yahweh. And so he goes on to say, what we're not concerned about here is the law and the morality of it itself, but we're concerned about what happens in Jeremiah 3. In Jeremiah 3, there's a divorce decree, but what happens? The same thing that happens in Hosea. God returns to his wife, who he has thrown out, divorced. In the book of Jeremiah, the poet appeals to this command from Moses. If a man divorces his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man's wife, will he return to her? Would not such a land be greatly polluted? Jeremiah 3:1. Skipping down, what astounds us is that this exposition of the command of Moses in verses 2-5, an exposition completely congruent with the original command, is immediately thrown over by Yahweh's pathos-filled utterances in verses 12-14, 19-23. Yahweh now bids in passionate, plaintive terms that wife Israel should return to her first husband, Yahweh. Skipping down, it is clear that the old command to which Yahweh has just subscribed and Yahweh's present yearning for fickle Israel are in profound tension with each other. It is equally clear that Yahweh is willing to overthrow and contradict the old command of Moses, Yahweh's own command for the sake of the relationship. Yahweh, as it turns out, cares more passionately for the relationship than for the old command. Skipping forward, but since the old law here is quoted with approval, and since the departure from it is in Yahweh's own mouth, we must take this as evidence in the testimony of Israel that Yahweh has an intense self-contradiction between norms and yearning. In this case, the yearning wins out. Keep these things in mind when it comes to Hosea, that Yahweh, God, is throwing off cultural norms that defile the land if violated. God is going through a defiling act by receiving back his love, calling back Israel and receiving him to him. Now, did northern Israel ever return to Yahweh, return to God? No, they're scattered, they're lost, they are no more. So this never came to fruition, but it was God's hope that they would return and he would accept them back. Notice what's going on here in both these passages. Jeremiah 3, Hosea, and elsewhere. God is willing to accept back a wife who has been having extramarital affairs, who have been sleeping with other men, women who have been involved in the most heinous of situations, very humiliating to God, and God's willing to accept them back. At what cost? At the cost of even polluting the land. As made explicit in Jeremiah, God is willing to go against tradition. God is going to humiliate himself. He's willing to forego his dignity, his pride, in order to accept back that unfaithful wife and take her again as the wife. And by his own admission, it's defiling the land. This is not a good look for God. This is self-humiliation, and it's within the Bible. And God is not talking in just terms that we could just throw away or ignore. This is something we need to take seriously, that God's willing to go through this self-humiliation. So back to my meme on Twitter, where I'm dealing with modern Christian number 1, we'll call him. He says, regardless of your interpretation of the second commandment, that meme is gross and completely irreverent. It's gross and irreverent. And I said, hey, have you ever read Hosea? Okay. And then I said, I'll help you out. And I start quoting Hosea. And this is how he responds. Modern Christian example number 1. Yes, I'm well aware of the book of Hosea. Or are you? It's not quite evident. How does posting a meme using a modern term meant to mock the one being cheated on, used to call the one being cheated on pathetic and weak? How is that in any way comparable to what God said in Hosea? That's the entire point of the book. That's what Hosea is about. That's what's happening in Hosea. God is going through a self-humiliation ritual, public humiliation. God is casting aside his dignity, his pride. God is groveling. God is taking back that cheating wife after being cheated on knowingly and willfully, and enduring that for countless amount of time. That is what is happening in Hosea. Within the Bible, God goes through self-humiliating, self-deprecating rituals in regards to his love for his people. And he's willing to do that because of his pathos. He's even willing to forego his own rules, his own guidelines, and the morality that he gives to his people. He's willing to forego that because of his love of his people. It's something we need to consider and factor into our theology. Now, if we hold a theology that doesn't allow God to be humbled, God to have self-humiliation or make self-deprecating remarks, we're not holding a theology of the Bible. We should reconsider our theological perspective, our theological priors, because this happens within the Bible, happens quite obviously, happens quite pronounced, and is just a facet of the text. And so if that's incompatible with our greatest being theology, or how we think about God and how God acts, his character, his personality, his temperament, if those things are incompatible, maybe we should reconsider our priors. Anyways, questions or comments, put that down below or start a thread on the God is Open Facebook group. Thank you for listening.